Matthew Grant watched himself in the reflection of a storefront, an impeccably aligned figure in a precisely cut suit. His tie, a point of sober color, was perfectly symmetrical, just like the spreadsheet he was filling out on his tablet. Every detail of his life, from his morning routine to the expansion plan for his culinary tech startup, Flavortech, was a cold, rational calculation. This was the essence of his existence: order, efficiency, and control. The family restaurant, Grandma's table, a traditional eatery he had inherited years ago, remained a ghost of the past that he rarely visited, but which now, by a twist of fate, had become the center of an unforeseen problem and a forced turning point in his meticulously planned life. He needed a wife, not for affection or companionship, but as a fundamental piece in his business strategy. Investors, especially the more traditional ones, saw the figure of a family man as a symbol of stability and trust, an image that the solitary, work-focused Matthew couldn't project. The weight of the expectation of a life he never wanted manifested in a constant headache, a low, persistent hum that only silenced when he immersed himself in numbers and algorithms. He saw marriage as another contract, a commercial transaction that, if well executed, would solve a problem and allow him to move forward with his plans. Emotion was a variable he refused to include in his equations. On the other side of the city, in an improvised and chaotic kitchen, Isabel Harris mixed ingredients with a passion that bordered on rebellion. Her hair, tied in a messy bun, had traces of flour, and her apron, a worn and stained fabric, was a map of her latest creations. She danced between pots and pans, improvising with what she had, her eyes shining with the promise of a new flavor. Her life was a series of impulses, of trials and errors, of grandiose dreams and bills that didn't get paid. The passion for cooking was her only compass in a sea of financial uncertainty and family pressure to find a real job, a job that offered the security that she, in her restless soul, so despised. Isabel felt time slipping through her fingers. The unexpected layoff from the restaurant where she worked had left her adrift, with the weight of a family that depended on her, and a dream that seemed more and more distant. The walls of her small kitchen, impregnated with the smell of basil and rosemary, were her only refuge. The phone rang. It was her sister's voice, full of worry and a veiled ultimatum. "You need a plan, Isa," she said. Isabel knew it, but the idea of a planned life scared her. It was like imprisoning a bird in a gilded cage. But how could she plan when her heart only wanted to create, explore, and live without the constraints of a predefined routine? The meeting at the Flavortech headquarters was a study in contrasts. On one side, the minimalist high-tech meeting room; on the other, the most bizarre marriage proposal Isabel had ever heard. Matthew, with the same precision as an algorithm, laid out the terms: a 2-year marriage, residency at the family restaurant, full access to the kitchen, and a monthly sum for her expenses. The only catch: acting as his life partner at events and business meetings, maintaining the appearance of a solid union. The air in the room was charged with formality and awkwardness, a chasm of intentions between the two, a deal that seemed impossible to close. For Matthew, it was a perfect solution, a business deal without emotional risks, a way to solve a problem without having to deal with feelings. He saw the proposal as a fair trade, security and a space for Isabel to explore her passion in exchange for a facade of stability for his company. Isabel, in turn, saw the proposal as a lifeline, an opportunity she couldn't refuse. The idea of having her own space, a kitchen to call her own, was what drove her. The marriage was just the necessary bureaucracy to achieve her goal. Neither of them was prepared for the complexities of shared life that would unfold next. The silence in the car on the way to the old family restaurant was the music of their new agreement. Isabel, through the window, watched the bustling streets of Chicago, a city that swallowed her with its promises and disappointments. Matthew, at the wheel, mentally reviewed his week's agenda, fitting the new variable into his routine. He felt like a scientist, calculating the impact of a new element in a formula he thought was perfect. The silence was the barrier they built, an invisible wall of strangeness and unspoken expectations, a way of protecting themselves from a reality that seemed unreal. When they arrived, the restaurant revealed itself to be a time capsule. The facade, with the worn wooden sign and peeling paint, seemed suspended in time. The aroma, however, was unmistakable, a mixture of dried spices and memories that seemed to hang in the air. Matthew felt a knot in his throat, a familiar discomfort, the same feeling as when he had left everything behind in search of a more logical and modern life. The place, which he considered a burden, was now his home. The irony of fate was a bitter taste in his mouth, a taste he couldn't quantify. The kitchen, the heart of that place, was a sanctuary. Copper pans hung from the walls, a solid wooden table, and a wood-fired stove that seemed to have seen centuries of stories. Isabel felt a wave of ecstasy, a shiver down her spine. It was as if the kitchen invited her to create, to bring new life to a place that seemed to have fallen asleep. She touched the cold surface of the stove, imagining the heat of a flame, the smell of fresh-baked bread, the life she would bring to that space. She felt at home for the first time in a long time. Matthew watched her, a stranger in his own legacy. For him, that kitchen was a burden, a painful memory of a past he preferred to forget. Dossier, smell of spices, which for her was a promise, for him was a pain, an echo of a life he no longer wanted. He turned, heading towards his office, a refuge of technology and minimalism. The two, though in the same space, were in completely different worlds, each trapped in their own bubbles of pain and desire, separated by a chasm of intentions and feelings. The days that followed were a case study on forced coexistence. Matthew, with his rigid schedules and his almost maniacal organization, and Isabel, with her chaotic passion and creative mess. She would scatter flour on the floor. He would clean it up with a look of silent disapproval. She would leave pots soaking in the sink. He would put them away with an efficiency that seemed like a silent criticism. The apartment became a battlefield of opposing habits, an awkward dance between order and chaos, a game of chess where every move was a step toward conflict. On a rainy afternoon, while Isabel was experimenting with a new bread recipe, Matthew was on a video call with investors. The aroma of yeast and the soft sound of kneading dough invaded his office, a welcome intrusion into his sterile world. He was distracted for a moment. The memory of his mother baking bread, a moment of warmth and security, invaded his mind. He shook his head, forcing his focus back to the screen, to the numbers and graphs that were his only truth. It was a fragment of a life he had consciously locked in a dark box. At dinner, the first meal they shared, the silence was as heavy as the porcelain on the table. Isabel served a simple but flavorful dish, a creation of hers, a vegetable tart with a unique seasoning. Matthew, accustomed to quick, nutritional meals, ate with silent reverence. The taste of the food, the warmth of the dish, was something he hadn't experienced in years. It was a subtle reminder that life had a richness that his spreadsheets and algorithms couldn't quantify, a sensory experience that escaped all logic. The dinner ended with the same silence with which it began. The only sound was the clinking of silverware and the echo of unspoken questions. Isabel wanted to know about the restaurant, about Matthew's family, about the life he had left behind. Matthew wanted to understand Isabel's passion, the way she moved in the kitchen with a fluidity he would never experience. But the fear of crossing the line, of breaking the unspoken agreement, prevented them from speaking. They were two strangers at a table, united by a contract, but separated by a chasm of emotions. On a dusty shelf, Isabel found an aged leather notebook. The pages, yellowed and stained, were filled with elegant handwriting and family recipes. It was Matthew's father's recipe book. She leafed through the pages with an almost religious reverence, feeling the history and love that each note carried. The last recipe, however, was scribbled out, illegible, as if the hand that wrote it had been interrupted halfway through. There was a note, a code she couldn't decipher, a clue to a secret kept under lock and key. Isabel wondered what the recipe meant. Why had Matthew never mentioned it? Curiosity overcame her, and she felt the need to unravel that mystery, not just for herself, but for the emotional weight it seemed to carry. That notebook wasn't just a recipe book. It was a window into Matthew's soul, a secret he kept under lock and key, and she somehow had stumbled upon her first clue. It was the first sign that their life wouldn't be as simple as they had planned. That night, Matthew had a nightmare. He was in the kitchen, but the place was cold, dark, and empty. His mother's voice, a distant echo, called him. He tried to find her, but with every step, the floor disintegrated into numbers and codes. He woke up with a start, cold sweat on his forehead, the familiar hum in his head. He got up, went to the kitchen, and saw Isabel sitting at the table, the recipe book in her hand. Her gaze, full of questions, made him freeze. He felt exposed, vulnerable, like a book that had been opened to the wrong page. They stared at each other for a moment, a silence that said more than 1,000 words. He saw the curiosity and innocence in her eyes and felt a pang of panic. She had discovered the notebook, the vault of his most painful memories, and he didn't know how to react. She, in turn, saw the fear in his eyes, the same insecurity she felt when she thought about the future. They weren't so different after all, both lost in their own emotional labyrinths, looking for a way out that didn't seem to exist. What did Matthew's father hide in that recipe? The incident with the notebook served as a catalyst. From then on, the silence between them was no longer one of strangeness, but of palpable tension. The air was charged with unspoken words, with furtive glances, and a mutual curiosity that they tried in vain to ignore. The facade of business partners began to crack, revealing the fissures of loneliness and the desire for connection that they both felt, but which neither had the courage to admit. Life, they realized, was more complex than any contract they could sign. The forced coexistence, which was once a series of silent confrontations, began to forge a strangely comfortable routine in its dysfunctionality. Isabel, with her chaotic energy, transformed the kitchen into a vibrant laboratory, and Matthew, although reluctant, became the first and only taster of her creations. In the beginning, he analyzed the dishes with the objectivity of a software engineer, measuring textures and flavors with an almost comical precision. However, over time, he found himself anticipating the moment she would call him, the anxiety of knowing what she had created, a new and frightening emotion. Isabel's old apron, stained and worn, became a symbol of her passion, and the fact that he was the only one to witness her art became an intimate secret between the two, a bond that grew stronger with each new recipe. The cultural clash between them manifested itself in small details that had previously gone unnoticed. Matthew's refrigerator, once full of ready-made meals and green juices, was now filled with fresh, colorful ingredients that he could barely identify. She forced him out of his comfort zone to try new flavors and to question the logic of his rigidly controlled diet. One day, she caught him eating a tasteless yogurt and, with a mischievous smile, challenged him to try a crème brûlée she had made. He hesitated, but curiosity won, and the crack of the spoon breaking the thin layer of caramelized sugar echoed in the silent kitchen, a sound that broke the rigidity of his world. A sweet rebellion he began to appreciate and secretly to hope for. On a Saturday afternoon, Matthew found himself helping Isabel assemble a spice rack. He, the man who delegated complex tasks to a team of engineers, was holding a shelf while she hammered. The simple, unpretentious manual labor forced him to lower his guard. His hands, accustomed to keyboards and touchscreens, were dirty with dust, and he felt alive, connected to something real, something that wasn't made of pixels and algorithms. They worked in silence, an unlikely partnership that was formed in small gestures and exchanged glances. That moment of pure cooperation was the first brick in the construction of a bridge between the two, a solid foundation for what would be their future. The business meetings, where they had to act as the perfect couple, became easier and even fun. They learned to read each other's glances, to complete sentences, and to create a love story that was so convincing that even they themselves began to question it. A kiss on the cheek, a subtle touch on the hand, a gesture of affection invented for the public became more and more real and spontaneous. The line between pretense and reality began to blur, and a new kind of connection, tenuous and frightening, began to form. Matthew realized that behind the facade, he was truly beginning to enjoy Isabel's company, the way she lit up the rooms, the spontaneous laughter that broke the heavy silence of his life. The tension escalated when a rival chef, the ambitious and arrogant Peter, appeared with a proposal to buy the restaurant. He praised the tradition, but insinuated that the place was obsolete and needed a professional hand to modernize. Matthew, irritated by Peter's arrogance, refused to sell, and Isabel, feeling the weight of responsibility on her shoulders, defended the place with a passion that scared her. They, who had entered into this by an agreement, were now united in a fight to protect something that, somehow, had become theirs. It was more than a restaurant. It was the home they were building. The unexpected return of Luke, Isabel's ex-boyfriend, a free-spirited photographer who now had a stable job, destabilized the fragile balance they had built. Luke, with his familiarity and shared history, represented a threat to Isabel's new life. He looked at Matthew with suspicion, and at Isabel with a possessiveness that made her uncomfortable. Matthew, in turn, felt a pang of jealousy, an emotion he didn't know he was capable of feeling. The confrontation, although silent, was clear. Matthew, accustomed to controlling all variables, was dealing with something that could not be calculated. The heart, which seemed to have a logic of its own, and was uncontrollable. Matthew's jealousy consumed him on a rainy night. Irritated, he confronted Isabel. "Are you willing to give all this up for him?" he asked, his voice low but filled with emotion. She, shocked by the question, hesitated. The answer, "I don't know," was a silent bomb that exploded between them, separating them in a chasm of distrust and hurt. They distanced themselves for a few days. The barrier of silence returned, thicker and heavier than before. The marriage, once a farce, was now a lie that hurt. Trust, fragile as glass, had been broken, and rebuilding it seemed impossible, a distant dream that shattered into pieces. In his solitude, Matthew returned to the dark room of the restaurant, the smell of mold and the past suffocating him. He picked up his father's recipe book, leafing through the pages, the scribbles and notes. He remembered the last time he had seen his father in the kitchen, sick, but with a sparkle in his eyes that he only saw in Isabel. The final, illegible recipe was a reminder of what he had lost, of the life he had denied. He felt a wave of guilt and regret, the weight of the decision to run from his roots. He wondered if, like his father, he was losing what really mattered, the essence of life that was fading without him realizing it. Isabel, in her own solitude, cleaned her old apron, a metaphor for her stained soul. She felt lost, a stranger in what, for a moment, she thought was her new home. She questioned the contract, the marriage, what she really wanted. Her dream of a kitchen, of a space to call her own, seemed small and insignificant in the face of the pain she felt. She realized that it wasn't just the physical space she was looking for, but a place where she could be herself, loved and accepted in her imperfection, something she had found for a brief moment with Matthew and which now seemed to have been lost forever. The forced distance made them reflect, each in their own corner. They caught themselves, thinking about each other, remembering the small gestures, the moments of shared silence, the unexpected laughs. Matthew, in one of his meetings, saw a flour stain on the sleeve of his shirt, a remnant of the last time he helped Isabel bake bread. He smiled, a sad and melancholy smile, and smelled the yeast in his mind. Isabel, in her kitchen, saw his apron, folded with a precision that made her sigh. They were connected, no matter how much they tried to separate, an invisible bond that was formed with every detail, every memory. The tension between them was so dense it could be cut with a knife. Days passed, and the distance between them increased. Matthew locked himself in his office, immersed in spreadsheets, the pain in his chest manifesting as a knot in his throat. Isabel, in turn, cooked with a silent fury, each cut, each kneading of dough, a way to release frustration and hurt. They didn't talk to each other, but the presence of the other was a constant, painful reminder of what they were losing. They became ghosts in their own home, echoing in a space that for a moment seemed filled. Matthew began to have flashbacks, fragments of memories he had buried. The image of his father in the hospital bed, the weak voice, the hand holding the recipe book as if it were a treasure. He remembered the smell of the hospital, the sound of the heart monitor, and the silence that followed. His father had tried, in his last breath, to say something about the recipe, but the illness had silenced him. Matthew, in his pain and confusion, had convinced himself that the passion for cooking had killed his father, and that's why he had fled from everything that reminded him of that place, of that life. Isabel, meanwhile, dedicated herself to the recipe book. She sat at the kitchen table, deciphering the notes, the ingredients, the handwriting of Matthew's father. She felt a connection to that man she never met, a connection that was formed in the details of each recipe, in the passion that manifested in every word. She tried in every way to decipher the last recipe, the recipe that seemed to be the key to Matthew's mystery, the key to his heart. She knew that the answer was there, hidden somewhere in the yellowed pages. The tension between them reached its peak at a Flavortech gala. Dressed to impress, they acted as the perfect couple, smiling at investors, exchanging calculated glances. However, the subtext was clear. Matthew, in his impeccable suit, felt the pressure of maintaining the pretense, while Isabel, in an elegant dress, felt the pain of being a living lie. The glare of the spotlights was a cruel contrast to the darkness that consumed them inside. Amidst the glamour of the party, one of the investors, an old man with a keen eye, approached Matthew. He praised Isabel's talent and the passion she showed for cooking, insinuating that the life of a CEO and a cook was an unlikely combination. The subtle question, but loaded with Intention was a challenge. "What really brought you two together?" he asked, with a smile that seemed to hide a secret. Matthew's uncertainty was palpable, and he felt exposed before everyone. Later, in a moment alone, Isabel confronted Matthew. "Why didn't you defend me?" she asked, her voice low but trembling with hurt. "You treat me like an accessory, a facade for your life." "I'm more than that, Matthew." Her words were like arrows in his chest. He felt guilty, ashamed for having hidden behind a contract and a life he had created for himself. He realized that in his search for order, he had neglected what really mattered, the respect and passion she deserved. The distance deepened. Isabel felt devalued, and Matthew consumed by guilt. They no longer spoke, and the presence of the other was a constant reminder of the hurt they felt. The silence of the house, which was once of strangeness, was now of pain. They were two ships adrift, trapped in the same sea, but unable to get closer. The marriage, which was supposed to be a solution, was now a weight, a burden that prevented them from being happy. The turning point came on a cold night. Peter, the rival chef, called Matthew with a final offer and an ultimatum: sell the restaurant, or he would run a story about their sham marriage. Panic rose in Matthew's throat. His company's reputation, the stability he so sought, was at risk. And in the midst of the panic, the first person he thought of was not a lawyer or an investor, but Isabel. He needed her, her strength and her passion. He called, his voice trembling, asking her to meet him at the restaurant, the stage of his greatest memories and the refuge of his pains. They met at the restaurant, in the middle of the night. The only light came from the street and shadows danced on the walls. He told her about Peter, about the blackmail, about the risk they were running. He looked at her, not as a business partner, but as the only person he could trust. Isabel listened to everything, the shock giving way to a cold determination. She would not allow him to take what they had built, the life they were trying to create. She knew the fight would be difficult, but she wasn't alone. She felt a strength that pushed her to fight for what was hers. The revelation of Peter's plan united them again, not by contract, but by a shared cause. They sat at the kitchen table, the recipe book between them. Isabel, with a pen, began to try to decipher the final recipe, while Matthew, for the first time, began to tell the story of his father, of the illness, of the last time he saw him. He talked about the guilt, about the fear of following in his footsteps, of getting lost in a passion he didn't understand. And, in the middle of the story, he confessed what the recipe represented: his father's love for cooking and the pain of not being able to reproduce it, a recipe that was lost with his father's life. The revelation of Matthew's secret broke the last barrier between them. Isabel listened to him with an empathy that disarmed him. She understood his pain, the way he used order and logic as armor against the world. She leaned across the table, touched his hand, and said that it didn't matter if he couldn't cook. What mattered was the story, the passion, the will to honor his father's memory. And in that moment, Matthew saw Isabel not as a partner, but as his soulmate, someone who understood what he couldn't express, someone who saw the real him, beyond the CEO image he had created for himself. The conversations stretched through the night, and they delved into their pains and fears. Isabel revealed her family's pressure, the fear of being a failure, the insecurity about her own talent. Matthew listened to her, not with the logic of a CEO, but with his heart. He encouraged her, made her believe in her own potential, to see the value of her passion. They became each other's safe haven, the fortress each one needed to face the challenges of the world. They were no longer strangers, but accomplices, a duo united by vulnerability and mutual trust, an alliance forged in pain and hope. In a moment of vulnerability, Isabel looked at him, at his tired eyes, but full of a new light, and asked if he really needed to marry her to keep up appearances. The question, although simple, was a punch in Matthew's gut. He fell silent, the words stuck in his throat. He didn't need to, and he knew it. What he wanted, what he really needed was her. Life with her was a mess, a chaos, but it was real. It was full of flavors, of laughter, of an emotion he didn't know was possible. He didn't answer, but the silence was an answer. And what did that mean for the marriage agreement? The emotional crisis deepened. They, who had built such a perfect facade, now found themselves confronted with the truth. The contract was a lie, an excuse to be together. But now, with the danger of losing the restaurant, and with the ghost of the ex-boyfriend, the farce was about to be exposed. They distanced themselves again, not out of anger but out of fear. Fear of admitting what they felt, fear of giving in to something that couldn't be planned, fear of getting hurt. The marriage, which was a solution, was now the cause of their greatest pain, an open wound that bled every second. The emotional time bomb was about to explode, and there was no way to defuse it unless they had the courage to face the truth of their feelings. The climax came on a rainy night. Peter, the rival chef, showed up at the restaurant. Matthew and Isabel were there, together but separate, the tension between them almost suffocating. Peter, with a sneer, dropped the bomb. He had done his research and knew their marriage was a contract. He had photos, documents, and the story was ready to be published. The shock, the fear, the shame, everything mixed into a single, painful moment. But in the middle of the storm, a spark of courage shone. Matthew, for the first time, didn't think in numbers but in feelings, and looked at her with a new clarity. He looked at Isabel, and in an act of unexpected bravery, kissed her. Not a facade kiss, but a real kiss. A kiss full of love, of fear, of regret. The kiss was a confession, a breaking of all the rules he had imposed on himself. It was a declaration that he no longer cared what the investors thought, what the press would publish. What mattered was what he felt for her, and her response. The kiss returned was the confirmation that the love they had built was stronger than any contract. Peter, shocked by the reaction, backed away. He didn't expect the pretense to be real. The story, which he thought would be a scandal, became the story of an unexpected love. The tension in the air, which was once fear, was now an overwhelming relief. The confrontation, which was supposed to be a rupture, became a revelation. They, united by the kiss, looked at Peter and, without saying a word, showed that love, true love, could not be bought or sold. But the fight for the restaurant was not yet over. What would the couple do next? The decision they would make now could change the fate of the restaurant forever. After Peter's departure, the silence that settled between Matthew and Isabel was no longer one of strangeness, but of a deep intimacy. They sat at the kitchen table, their hands clasped over the open recipe book, their hearts still beating in unison. The kiss had been a declaration, a point of no return. Matthew, the man who avoided chaos and emotion, now felt, for the first time in years, at peace. He looked at Isabel, and her image, with her dirty apron and eyes full of a light he had never seen in anyone, became his new compass. They knew that the fight for the restaurant was not over. Peter could come back. The press was still a threat, but now they had each other. The model of the restaurant, a project Isabel had secretly drawn, was on one of the kitchen shelves. It was a vision of a future they could build together. The model, a symbol of hope, mixed the old, the traditional, with the modern, the innovative. It was the perfect synthesis of them, the union of two worlds that, somehow, had become one. The restaurant would, from now on, be the reflection of their love, a place where the past and the future met. Together, they decided they would renovate the restaurant. The idea was to unite the tradition of Matthew's father with Isabel's. Innovation, Matthew with his business mind, and Isabel with her passion for cooking, formed an unbeatable team. They transformed the restaurant into a new space, a place where history and the future met. The renovation was an arduous job, a journey of self-discovery and teamwork. They laughed, they fought, but they never gave up. The work on the restaurant became a reflection of their relationship, built with affection, patience, and a dose of passion, brick by brick, recipe by recipe. Inside the middle of the renovation, they returned to the recipe book. The last recipe, the one Matthew refused to reproduce, was now the center of their attention. They leaned over the handwriting, the scribbled notes, and together began to decipher the mystery. The recipe was a symbol of Matthew's father's life, of his fears, of his hopes, of his love for his family. The secret ingredient which Matthew had forgotten was a rare herb that only grew on the mountain where the family used to spend their summer vacations. It was a memory of happy times, of a life he had left behind. They traveled to the mountain on a journey that was more than a search for an ingredient. It was a search for the past, for forgiveness, for reconciliation with Matthew's history. They found the herb, and upon returning, the restaurant kitchen, now renovated, became the stage for a recreation. Matthew, for the first time, put on an apron and joined Isabel in the kitchen. He wasn't a chef, but he was there, by her side, in a collaboration that went beyond cooking. The recipe, which was once a symbol of pain, was now a symbol of love, of forgiveness, of healing. The restaurant reopened with a new name, Shared Flavors. The inauguration was a success, with investors, family and friends present. The menu, a fusion of Matthew's traditional cuisine with Isabel's innovative one, was a reflection of their journey. The special dish, Matthew's father's last one, now with a new look and a touch of Isabel's innovation, was the highlight. The dish, with its complex flavor and its history, was a reminder that love and life are built through imperfections and teamwork. The success of the restaurant and the overcoming of all obstacles, including Peter, who apologized, became a symbol of their love. They, who had started with a cold and formal contract, were now together out of an overwhelming passion. Matthew had transformed from a solitary and methodical man to a loving and passionate partner. Isabel, in turn, had found her purpose, her voice, and her place in the world. They were no longer just strangers, but a family. The marriage, which was a farce, was now real. That night after the inauguration, they sat in the restaurant kitchen, now clean and lit. They were exhausted but happy. Matthew looked at Isabel, at her tired but radiant smile. He kissed her, a kiss full of tenderness and gratitude. He knew that their love had not been planned, but it was the most real. Thing in his life. He thanked her for breaking all his rules, for bringing chaos and life into his world, for making him feel whole again. Isabel, in turn, looked at him, at the man she had helped find himself. She thanked him for giving her a place, a voice, and a love. They, who had signed a marriage contract, now truly loved each other. Life, they learned, is not a spreadsheet, but a recipe full of unexpected ingredients, of mistakes, of successes, but that, in the end, always leads to a special flavor. Their love was the perfect recipe, and the restaurant, the home where they would live this story. The last scene shows them in the kitchen, under the soft light of the lamps. They are sitting side by side, hands held, the restaurant model between them. He picks up the model and turns it so she can see a detail he had added, a small table for two, right in the corner of the kitchen, where they could have quiet dinners, just for them. Isabel smiles, a smile full of tears of joy, and kisses him. They had found their happy ending, genuine love and personal fulfillment. They no longer needed a contract. The document, which was once a legal formality, was now a distant memory of a time when they were strangers. What they had now was much more valuable, a promise to be together, to build a life, to face all challenges hand in hand. Their love was the true contract, a contract from soul to soul, a contract that didn't need paper, but a heart. The story of Matthew and Isabel became a local legend. The restaurant, with its mix of tradition and innovation, became a landmark for the city. People didn't go there just for the food, but for the love story that unfolded in every dish, in every detail. The place, which Matthew had considered a burden, was now his greatest treasure. And the passion his father had left behind was now the passion he shared with the woman he loved. The two, with their opposite habits and complementary souls, continued to create, to dream, to live. Matthew, with his business mind, and Isabel, with her limitless creativity, formed a perfect duo. They learned that life is not about control, but about the beauty of getting lost, of improvising, of finding happiness in the most unexpected places. Life with her was a chaos, but a wonderful chaos, a chaos that made him feel alive. The marriage, which was supposed to be a farce, was now the most real thing in their lives. The 2-year promise became a promise of a lifetime. They married again, this time, not in a cold and formal ceremony, but in a flowering garden, with family and friends, and the smell of basil and rosemary in the air. They looked at each other, and the love they felt for each other was so palpable that it could be felt by everyone present. It was the celebration of a love that began with a contract, but ended in a happy ending, an ending they could never have planned, but which was the best of all. They lived happily ever after, with the restaurant as a witness to their journey. The shared flavors were not just those of cuisine, but of life, of love, of friendship, of family. They became one, not by law, but by heart. And with every dish they served, they remembered the journey that brought them there, the contract that united them, and the love that made them stay together forever.